So good afternoon, take your seat. Welcome everybody for this book talk, now on site. And I know that some people have taken the habit over these difficult times we had to be online and to get used to listen online, but I think it's good to be back in the library reading room and to have also the opportunity to have this quality exchange that we are having here. And we are particularly happy today because I think the book talk started 6 years ago, if I count well, and it was you, Loukas, that was already presenting a book at the time, and Gaby was moderating. So that's great to have you back here with us today. We are going to talk about your book, Europe in the Coming Age. I like to say also that beyond being a book author, you are Professor at the Paris Schools of International Affairs, Sciences Po, and Emeritus Professor at the University of Athens, and President of the Board of the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP. And as I said, Gaby will moderate this book talk, and everybody knows Gaby. She's a non-resident visiting fellow at EPRS, so she's a bit one of us, but she's also, as the main activity, part-time professor at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. So these book talks over the 6 years, if we look backwards a little bit, they have been about European politics, about the governance of Europe, about leadership of Europe, and we have covered really a lot of ground on these very diverse issues. So I hope you are going to enjoy the session. We have 1.5 hours, and this session is also web stream, and I encourage already the colleagues and friends that are following online to take advantage of the chat functions and to put their questions there if they have any. Many thanks again for being with us today. Many thanks to Loukas to have done this trip, and also to you, Gaby, because you came from Florence straight ahead, and I hope you will enjoy the session.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Etienne, for the invitation. Thanks, Loukas, for joining. And thank you for being here in person. I know that there are a lot of things going on today, also important conferences on female leadership. So I very much appreciate you being here to talk about a very interesting book and marking 6 years of what we had established in 2017 as a forum for academics and EU staffers to EP staffers to get in contact, to talk about intellectual journeys, to talk about analysis and research directly at the heart of the institution. So to, if you so wish, close a bit the gap between science and policy at the heart of the European Parliament. And I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces. Thank you for coming in person and also online, because I already heard that some of our friends are online today. So 6 years ago, but literally nearly on the very day, so it was 22nd June 2017 when we met. Ever since then, we have 30 book talks. We reached personally more than 2,800 participants online and in person here, plus the YouTube usage. So you see that it's quite a hunger for intellectual exchange on research on the EU. And in that sense, Loukas, we started in 2017 with your book In Defense of Europe, and the sheer comparison in between the titles of the books, it represents a bit of a journey, because today we meet to discuss the coming of age of Europe, with a question mark maybe, that in many ways represents also an intellectual journey from the first book, from In Defense of Europe, to present day, covering the developments of the European Union ever since 2020 with the question mark. And in the discussion, we will very much focus on the future. But Loukas, the book is a bit different from what you wrote so far and how you wrote it also in terms of the style. So the introduction is rather, as it's written, a declaration of intent. And I'm doing a bit of a spoiler now, because might be that we enter a bit of a discussion into skepticism, and I'm doing a spoiler on the overall backdrop of the analysis of Loukas that is still very much in the heart of European integration and integration theory, with a quote that I will ping back to you then to present us your book. It's from this introduction that it's more a declaration of intent, and it says, "Difficult to fall in love with the EU, isn't it? Unless you succeed in purifying your love object from grey bureaucrats, interminable negotiations, often impenetrable jargon lost in translation, and long-winded compromises that make it difficult to inspire even those who approach it with the best intentions. Yet, I remain convinced, and increasingly with time, that the construction of a European entity, which is more than the sum of the parts, represents the best hope for Europeans to preserve peace, freedom, democracy, and prosperity at home. Loukas, why did you write the book, and what does it tell us about Europe today and in the past?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the kind words of introduction. It is a pleasure to be here. It is, of course, an honor having inaugurated the Book Talk series 6 years ago, and now coming back to celebrate the 6th anniversary of your series. The book I wrote back then, as you, Gaby, pointed out, was a book that was published in times of doom and gloom. It was in the aftermath of the financial crisis. It was in the aftermath of the immigration crisis of 2015, and it was just after Brexit. So the subtitle to that book was, "Can the European project be saved?" ? I thought it should be saved. In fact, it has been saved. If anything, the experience of the last 6 years suggests that that one word that characterizes the European project is resilience, because this is really what comes out on the basis of the experience of the last more than 10 years of successive crises. My new book is different, not only because the times are different, but because I see things in a different way. It is the most ambitious, the most personal, and the most political book I've written. Let me explain very briefly. It is ambitious because I'm trying to look at the bigger picture. I'm trying to connect the dots between foreign policy, the internationalization of the euro, climate change, and high technology. I'm trying to link social policy, taxation, and growing inequalities in our fragmented societies. I'm trying to talk about the crisis of democracy, which is not just a European phenomenon, but it is a much more widespread phenomenon. And of course, looking at the bigger picture is always a risky exercise. Whether I've succeeded or not, whether the picture is hazy or not, it's up to the reader to judge. It is personal also because, especially in the first part of the book, which is a very eclectic approach to the history of European integration, concentrating on main turning points, I've used some of my personal experiences to illustrate the points I make. I do it sparingly. I don't overdo it, I hope. And I've done it because I think I have enough experiences from my own personal European journey, which has lasted several decades. And I have one thing, and this I've always been on the borderline between academia and policy. And I've tried to draw some lessons from it. And it is political. The book is political because I take a very clear stand. I use arguments, I use documentation and all the rest. I think, I hope I respect the views that I do not share, and I present them as kindly or as objectively as possible. But yet, I take a very clear stand, and let me summarize the main message of the book before I go on to discuss the contents. The main message of the book is that in a rapidly changing, increasingly unstable and threatening world, in a world characterized by growing strategic rivalry, by rising nationalism, and by very large asymmetries, a world where we are faced with the existential challenge not only of climate change, but also the existential challenge of technological change running amok and turning against us as human beings. The European Union is the only hope we have here in Europe to represent and defend our fundamental interests and values. And I believe that even more so than I did some years back, because among other things, in a highly asymmetrical world of growing strategic rivalry, The great powers of Europe are no longer big at the world stage. It's only a question of realizing their limitations. Europeans cannot negotiate and defend their interests, not only vis-à-vis the Chinese, but also the United States. And they cannot even defend their interests when they negotiate with Amazon, Microsoft, and other large multinational companies. So having said that, of course, our debate in this, let me say also, the book, of course, concentrates on challenges and therefore is forward-looking. But I think before you talk about the future, you need to understand where you come from and also where you stand today. And if you look back at the last almost 70 years of the European journey, of course, there have been no shortage of crises. There have been many ups and downs. But what really stands out is the spectacular expansion of the European project in terms of both functions and members. And this is really, there's no doubt about it, if you just have a look at the long-term trend. Now, many people have tried to explain this continuous expansion. In the past, people referred to the functionalist logic. Others talked about legal imperialism and the way the European Court of Justice has interpreted European law. There is an element of truth in both. There are others who believe in the conspiracy of the Illuminati, okay? And there are many people, and many of our fellow citizens, on this side of the Atlantic, and even more so on the other side of the Atlantic, who believe in conspiracy theories. Again, all these have some seeds of truth, yet, again, the most important thing, if you look back at the last 70 years, is the main explanation of the expansion of the project is, going back to the famous phrase of Harold Macmillan, events, my dear boy, events. The unexpected, the crises that have shaped European integration. Give you 3 examples. We wouldn't have euros in our pockets today had it not been for the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany. We wouldn't have had common vaccines and joint borrowing in the name of the European Union had it not been for the pandemic. We wouldn't have a still incomplete banking union had it not been for the financial crisis. So interesting question that arises today, will Mr. Putin end up being the greatest unifier of Europe? To which question there is no answer as yet. And of course, we spend a lot of time talking about a barbarous war, and we rightly do so. A war that, first of all, has cost already hundreds of thousands of lives, huge, immense catastrophe, physical destruction. A war that marks the end of the post-Cold War order in Europe, admittedly largely shaped by those who had won the Cold War. And now Mr. Putin has decided to resort to arms to challenge the order. And also it marks the end of several decades of economic interdependence between Russia and the rest of Europe, largely based on energy, which was mutually beneficial as long as it lasted. And now many people accuse other Europeans of having been careless about allowing this to happen and therefore allowing the leader in the Kremlin to weaponize this interdependence. I'm not underestimating at all the importance and the barbarity of the war. But my main argument is that the war in Ukraine comes at the tail end of a series of big crises and major transformations that have radically changed the world we live in. So it's not only the Ukraine war, there are many other things. And I believe more and more that we live through the end of an era. And if I talk about the end of the era, I suppose I have to explain what the era was all about. The era lasted 30 to 40 years, depending on what is your main starting point and your point of reference. I think there are 3 main features of the era that is now leaving us. One was the dominance of market ideology, the prevalence of liberal economics at the expense of state. So the pendulum was shifting steadily away from the state towards the market. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. I'm stating a fact. The second was the undisputed hegemony of the United States. after the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. And the third was the integration of communist China into the global capitalist system. These I believe to have been the three main features of the era that is closely coming to an end or is under serious trouble. Now, the state is making a comeback, and it's not only now, it's been making a comeback for recent years. The state as a protector of people in times of crisis and as a provider of public goods, be it a livable environment to fight climate change, be it public health, and now security. The second thing is the undisputed hegemony of the United States is no longer. The Russians are challenging the order in Europe. The rise of China is challenging undisputed US hegemony. But it's more than that. It's not only the challenge to US hegemony, but developments within the United States itself. The United States today is an extremely unequal and divided society, more unequal and more divided than it has been for many decades, with an extremely polarized political system, which makes the United States a less predictable, or perhaps you might say even a less reliable partner and protector for Europeans. We've already had the experience of Mr. Trump, and there's nothing to guarantee us that Mr. Trump will not be back, or a clone of Mr. Trump will not be back after 2024. And for most Europeans, such an idea sends shivers down their spines, although they may not be willing to say it in public. And the last point is that we are at a time when we're talking about decoupling and de-risking of our economic relationship with China. We have not yet defined how far the de-risking and the decoupling would go, but it will come at a very serious economic cost. So this is a different world. And this different world is in the process of shattering some of the main assumptions with which we Europeans have been living for decades. Let me present them in a simplified and slightly provocative fashion. First is that we believe for decades that we want to be in a system in a multilateral system with the rules in which Europe and the European Union in particular will be able to exert its soft power. This is the stuff that Brussels' dreams are made of and have been made of for years. I'm sorry to report to you that this multilateral system with rules in which Europeans can exert their soft power is kaput, or is gradually disappearing. And the second thing is the assumption that Europe can be a trade and a regulatory superpower while delegating responsibility for its security to its protector and ally on the other side of the Atlantic. This is also changing, first of all, because free riding has a time limit. Mr. Trump put it in his inimitable and undiplomatic fashion, but more polite Americans are still saying the same thing, that free riding is no longer tolerable. And second, because our American ally has become increasingly difficult and unpredictable. And also because there are areas in which interests between Europe and the United States may not necessarily converge or coincide, notably relations with China and the rest of the world. So, my conclusion is that Europe needs to become, the EU needs to become an economic, a political adult in such a world. Otherwise, Europe's decline will be accompanied with marginalization. And I can give you 3 or 4 areas where we have to change. One is industrial policy. The European Commission, European institutions do not have it in their DNA to talk about industrial policy. They were only talking about liberalization and about regulation. This is a different, so you need to reprogram European institutions, and especially the Commission, to think in different terms. And you have to do that because the rest of the world is doing it. The Chinese have been doing it extremely efficiently for the last few decades, but our American friends are also doing it. So you have to find a response. Second, we have to deal with taxation because we need to help our member states and also our European institutions to raise more money in order to finance public goods. The Green Deal will require funds that we simply do not have at our disposal today. So the money has to come from somewhere. And the money will not come just from borrowing at times when interest rates are rising. Okay? So, but again, with taxation, we have a system of unanimity, which means that we do very little or nothing on taxation. So how do you deal with that? And last but not least, foreign policy and defense. In a world characterized by strategic rivalry, in a world where economic interdependence is more and more being weaponized, you have to discuss the role of Europe and the European Union as an international actor. So you have to discuss foreign policy and defense. And there again, we are constrained by unanimity, among other things, which means that if you have unanimity, all your foreign policy declarations will be hostage to any unnamed person in the European Union of 27 who may use this as a way to blackmail the rest. Okay, so we are talking about radical changes. Are we able to do those changes? I'm not sure. In fact, when I present my book, I am often asked the question, should there be a question mark at the end of the title? Europe's coming of age, question mark. And my answer to that question is that had I written the book as an academic, I would have put 3 question marks. But because I'm writing it not just as an academic, but as a political animal, so this is not only an analysis, but it's a call to arms. There is no need for question marks. That's all.
That's all, which is quite a lot already, actually. I want to dive into 2 points before we open the discussion to the floor, and please keep your questions in mind and raise your hand when you want to come in. Loukas, you talked about these 4 different policies that now become relevant: industrial policy, defense, and
taxation.
Taxation, yes, but actually the 2 points that I want to pick up on are geopolitics on the continent, which in a way embraces these elements too. And the second one, then the EU's role economically in globalization. So the first part, if we look into the consequences of 22, the war on Ukraine, with the membership status, candidate status for Ukraine, didn't that move put us as the European Union in a way in the position to have to marry all of these areas? We need to talk about enlargement in a differentiated way, obviously, because the time span doesn't allow for our past procedures and political trajectories. We need to marry security issues with enlargement, with accession process, and in a way we need to reframe European security architecture ideas, looking into Article 42.7, for example, with military considerations. As much as it was necessary to have this symbolic step towards the candidate status in the situation as a visible reaction, tangible reaction of the European Union, in how far did the geopolitics, the backdrop of geopolitics that made the decision necessary, made future enlargement policy quasi-impossible without internal reforms?
Okay, so before I move on to enlargement, which is a huge subject, and it's one of the big questions we have to face, let me say 1 or 2 words about our reaction to the war in Ukraine. I mean, if you look at the bright side of the moon, the European Union has responded. It has provided aid to Ukraine, military and economic. It has provided arms paid by the EU budget, which is breaking yet one more of our old taboos. It has imposed ever-increasing sanctions on Russia, despite the need for unanimity. And we have not done badly in terms of rapidly diversifying our sources of energy, which may also be accompanied by an acceleration of the transition to renewables, which will be a good thing if it materializes. All this is true. So this is the bright side of the moon. The darker side of the moon tells you that we have discovered how weak and vulnerable we are. Our dependence is greater than it used to be, not in energy terms, but in military terms. We realized, yet we should have known it by now, but we realized once again that Europeans cannot defend the European continent without the United States. When I'm talking about the difficult relationship between Europe and the United States, given developments in the United States, I'm not suggesting any kind of divorce. The only thing I'm saying is that Europe gradually needs to create a European pillar within the Atlantic Alliance and needs to create a more symmetrical relationship with the United States. This is the only safe way to guarantee the survival of the Atlantic Alliance, given developments on both sides of the Atlantic. Now, and we have also discovered that things happen on our backyard and we are not the main actors. There are others who decide, much more importantly than us. Now, going to enlargement, I welcome the decision to welcome Ukraine as a candidate country. But we know, if we want to be honest to ourselves, that the European Union is not ready to take Ukraine or most of the other countries in the foreseeable future. Because if you take, forget Ukraine for the time being, take some of the other countries and from 27 you become 32 or 33, you simply run the very high risk of turning the European Union into a model of dysfunctionality, unless you introduce internal changes. So we have the experience with the Western Balkans. Some of them have been negotiating for years or waiting in the waiting room for years. And to be blunt, the negotiation with the Western Balkans is a negotiation of hypocrisy. We pretend to negotiate for accession, and they pretend to reform. Neither of the two happens, okay? Now, this can last for some years, but it cannot last forever, because it leads to huge frustration and disappointment. So I believe that the way to enlargement has to rest on three pillars if we want to be honest and realistic. First of all, internal reforms to prepare ourselves. Second, reduce the gap between accession and candidacy, which means I'm delighted that the President of the Commission has recently talked about increasing the budget for pre-accession to candidate countries, and therefore making the waiting room much more interesting and more substantial, and also more differentiation. I believe that the future of European integration lies with more differentiation. And again, it may not sound politically correct, but this is also based on the experience of the last 30 years. Almost all important initiatives in European integration have been based on differentiation, including most notably the Euro and Schengen. The crucial difference is that if you have coalitions of willing and able countries that move faster, they should leave always the door open for others to join later. This is crucial, because otherwise you will simply put in stone a Europe of concentric circles. And both the Euro and Schengen have proved that this is possible. We started with 11 currencies in the Euro, we now have 20. We started with 5 in Schengen, and we now even have non-EU members of Schengen. And this is the way for the future. So, because this is also the way to overcome the obstacle of unanimity, which tells you that you need unanimity in order to introduce majority. Otherwise, you can't do it. And some of our fellow partners in the exercise will never agree. So you have a choice between being a hostage forever or moving faster. So I believe that enlargement becomes possible if we start reforming internally, if we move towards a more staged integration, which makes the difference between a candidate and a member a smaller one than it has been until now, and you also rely on more differentiation. I mean, given the heterogeneity of Europe, I don't see any other way. And it will cost money. I mean, Ukraine, membership of Ukraine, or reconstruction of Ukraine will cost enormous amounts of money. We have to discuss who is going to pay it and where will the money come from. Again, if we want to be honest with ourselves and with our citizens. Okay. So that's my long answer to your question.
Thank you very much. I have a small question to the long answer, and a question then that is a bit of a polemic, but that leads us to the economic area that I wanted to say. So the small question to the long answer is, can we continue perceiving predominantly in the EU discourse enlargement policy as a political tool? Didn't that become with 2020 a geopolitical instrument that we have to be aware of in terms of also the linkages to security policy, military cooperation, the military development of European capabilities? So did the genetics of enlargement policy change to an extent that we haven't yet realized?
Okay, but we do that because we don't have any other tools. Okay, so Europe has to provide a response to the war in Ukraine. So what do we offer? We offer a European perspective, which a European perspective, unless we do other things, it will lead to enormous frustration on the Ukrainian side, as it has led to frustration in the Balkan countries. Because I think it's very likely we will not be able to deliver fast enough. And we're not able to deliver fast enough. And because the European Union is also, whether we like it or not, and I like it, is an organization based on rules and rule of law. It should be based on rules and the rule of law. Some of our fellow members take rule of law in a more flexible way than others. Okay? So, and take also the experience of enlargement. Enlargement has been, on the one hand, I believe, the most successful foreign policy of the European Union. I have no doubt about it. I mean, it has helped to export Pax Europaea to more unstable and less well-off parts of the European continent. In some countries it has been very successful, in others it has been less successful. And it has come at a price. Diversity and numbers make a difference to the way the European Union, the way you run a European Union cannot be the same of 6 or 12, cannot be the same, should not be the same as running a European Union of 35 countries that includes Finland, Portugal, Hungary, and Serbia. I mean, simple logic tells you that you must have a different approach to how you handle this thing. And for many people, enlargement has been seen as the kind of magic potion that cures all diseases. Well, it doesn't. Again, we've seen from experience that you simply do not export democracy by bringing a country in as a member of the European Union. There's more to it than that. So again, it's a call to realism that should force us to take a slightly different approach to enlargement. I'm not against enlargement.
No, that's not the perception of what you said. The perception is rather to really make us aware and have a realistic eye on what the instrument has become from both sides, demand and supply, right? So from the candidate country's perspective and from the EU's perspective. You deviated me from the polemics, which is good, because I want to jump in on something that you said about democracy. If we take the metaphor of coming of age for a second, as a basis, is the relation the EU has to develop with its internal democratic genetics, democracy, rule of law, human rights, diversity, conditionality. Will that fall prey to the new role and geopolitics that the EU faces in global politics? How can a realistic and pragmatic approach to the democratic core of the EU look like if we imagine the EU as a global actor that exerts power, that exerts influence?
Okay. I mean, we have values, and I suppose it is not, we shouldn't apply the motto of Groucho Marx, who said that I have values, but if you don't like them, I have other ones. Okay, we have values, and democracy should be one of our values. But Europeans have ceased being missionaries, and they've become realists because of experience. We are not going to change the regime in Beijing. We are not going to change the regime in Moscow. So I'm not an ardent believer in the fight between democracies and autocracies as the key feature of today's world. Okay? We have established a form of interdependence with China. This has helped to raise a few hundred millions of Chinese out of abject poverty. The Chinese have taken advantage of the rules of the game. We should try to rebalance that and either revise the rules or get them to respect the rules or take action accordingly. But we are not going to impose our understanding of democracy to China. So I don't believe that the relationship with China is a confrontation between democracies and autocracies. This is a rather Manichaean view that I don't share. Okay? Should we try? Of course we should promote our democratic values. But again, you see, if I may be even more provocative than I've been so far, we Europeans, or some of us Europeans, have a difficult history, including a colonial history. Okay? Now, and this is not forgotten in other parts of the world. In Asia, they have much longer memories than we Europeans have. Okay? So pointing the finger to violation of human rights coming from countries that violated human rights for 2 centuries in China may not be the most appropriate way of handling things. I mean, a bit of modesty on behalf of Europeans may be necessary and should be forthcoming. I know what I'm saying here doesn't sound very pleasant, but let us also be realistic in order to understand the reactions from what is now called the Global South. The Global South doesn't take our proclamations, takes them with a pinch of salt. Okay? And they say that when you have a war in Europe, this is supposed to be a global issue. When there is war in other parts of the world, it's a local problem. Okay? We have to move ahead from that. Otherwise, there will be no way of communicating with those countries.
Absolutely, that shined very much through in not only in the Security Council presentations of the colleagues from Africa, but also in the General Assembly votes on Ukraine resolutions, where I do think it's worth looking into as a European Union to indeed check the abstentions and see, okay, are there geopolitical constellations that we need to keep in mind? And my feeling is that this is done because you see European leaders travel to interesting places that haven't been on their agenda and on their world map before. What you say with the post-colonial responsibility and the transparency about that is very much something that I do think many of the global governance arenas like UNFCCC, climate change discussions, especially the Green Climate Fund, are missing from the Europeans to indeed start a discourse that not frames it as a development tool for countries, but as a reconciliation tool for industrialization, but also for colonial past. And there I do think that's a very good moment to understand that the effectiveness of the continent at the moment doesn't frame global governance as such, and Europe has to find the place there as a credible actor that enables rather than matronizes or patronizes in terms of development, right?
Patronizing. Okay.
Right, so coming to something very interesting that will be with us for quite a while, I assume, is geopolitics and economy. We will see in June on 20th, it's currently announced, the Europe's economic security doctrine, where the Commission starts proposing instruments that are very much alien and new, I assume, to European economic policy, like screening of foreign takeovers in the EU, penalties on subsidized competitors, outbound investment screening. So this is a very, very deep intrusion, if you so wish, in the market, right? That echoes a bit the national measures for COVID in terms of interaction and intervention in the markets. Yet we do have a strong member states competence in view of expert control. Is that a non-brainer by the moment it starts, or do you think that such an instrument can help us both internally to also champion our technological transformation and the economic transformation we need for sustainable and more green economic activities? Or do you think that the member states will cut that completely off the agenda because of their competencies?
Well, member states are not off the agenda because they have the instruments, okay? And take the example of the big dilemma we face with state aids. In a world of industrial policies, in a world where governments are spending money to attract investment, because take the Inflation Recovery Act of the United States, the good thing about it is that for the first time, the United States is head-on to deal with climate change and is now having active policies to promote the green transition in the United States. That's extremely welcome. But this is accompanied by Buy America and Produce in America Act with heavy subsidization. Now, the dilemma for Europeans is, if they do nothing, they may see many of the European firms investing in the United States instead of investing here. If they do something and they do it at the country level, then some member governments have deeper pockets than others. We already know during the pandemic, when we suspended the rules of state aids, that about 50% of total state aids were German aids, which means that unless you do something about it, there is no hope on earth that other European countries will be able to compete with Germany, right? Because Germany has deeper pockets than most of us have, okay? So you need to suspend state aids, but you need to control at the same time. Otherwise, you are going to blow up your single market. So you need to find a way of coordinating, controlling, but at the same time, you are not going to transfer the responsibility entirely to the European level, because I think I don't live in cuckoo land, to believe that member governments will simply transfer from one day to the next all responsibility and the budget for state aids to European institutions. So if this doesn't happen, we'll have to find a way in between. And poor Commission is trying to navigate between the Scylla and the Charybdis, to use a Greek mythology term, okay? And it's not easy. And the same thing applies to export controls. The same thing applies to controls on investment. So we recognize that member governments have the main responsibility, but we need to coordinate and eventually control excesses. And that, I think, applies to many other things. And that brings me also to the question about taxation. I don't believe that taxation is going to become a big issue. I mean, let me put it differently. I don't believe that taxation powers will simply be transferred from the national to the European level in the foreseeable future, at least not in my lifetime. But what I do believe is that the EU could play a role in facilitating the collection of tax revenues by member governments. For example, by introducing minimum levels of taxation on multinational companies, which we tried for years and we were not able to succeed because we needed unanimity. And then Mr. Biden becomes president and says the same thing, and those who vetoed the proposals inside the European Union felt they could not afford saying no to the United States. So again, this is a crash landing to reality, okay, within the European Union, that what is not possible within the European Union becomes possible if you have a US president who is prepared to say the same. That's life.
And shows the systemic and institutional vulnerability of the European Union, because it depends on an unpredictable future partner transatlantically, right?
Absolutely.
So,
and imagine, I mean, we have problems with an administration that has been much more open and understanding of Europe than we've had for a long time. So imagine if you have a different one in Washington. Just think about it and lose your sleep.
forever.
Okay.
So two follow-up questions on that. And the floor is open whenever you want to come in, please do so. What you just described, so the economic security doctrine, the question of harmonization or multi-level taxation administration or standards in the EU. Something that we haven't yet mentioned, the Green Deal, and the overall idea to transform economy in a future-oriented, sustainable, more eco-friendly way. Will all of that, or rather negatively, won't all of that have a tremendous impact on liberal market economy within the EU? Is there something going on that we're not yet realizing, that we need to open up the debate about how the economic model of the EU shall evolve over time?
Well, I mean, the Green Deal is the most ambitious thing we have produced for a very long time. And it is true that Europe has been a pioneer in the fight against climate change for quite some time, ahead of anybody else. The Green Deal is ambitious. If it materializes, it will essentially mean a new production model in Europe and hopefully the world, and a radical change in the way we consume and live. Is this understood in the wider public? Not yet. I mean, people say, they are in favor of green transition, but when the bill comes or when they have to change their everyday habits, they start having doubts and say, it's like the famous phrase of St. Augustine, God give me virtue, but not today. Tomorrow, after tomorrow. You don't rush with virtue. So, and we need to mobilize resources that we still do not have. I mean, it's important that almost 2/3 of the money from the recovery fund will be spent or should be spent on the green transition and the digital transition. That's excellent. I mean, the Europeans did it before the Americans and before anybody else. But it is not enough. We know that it is not enough. We need infrastructural investment that requires much more money. And therefore, we need a debate that touches the ordinary citizen, that brings the ordinary citizen. I remind you what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes. I mean, Macron increased carbon taxes in the name of climate policy. That's how he justified it. And there were hundreds and thousands of people in the streets blocking everything because they said that you think about the long-term future, we think about pockets for the next month and our ability to pay the bills. And you have to address this. But again, this is not easy because not only because of the general problem of democracy, but also because in today's world, it is the ephemeral that rules. Politicians cannot afford to discuss long-term issues because politicians are burnt from one day to the next. I mean, the idea of discussing a 5 or 10-year plan, you know, Mr. Xi in China can afford to discuss that. In Europe, the only person who can just about, in the first term, afford to do that is the French president, because you have an elected monarch for 5 years, all right? You have a person with enormous powers that nobody else has in any other European country. But ordinary, especially coalition politics in most European countries, discuss 5 and 10-year plans. I mean, how do you reconcile this with the functioning of our democracy as it functions today? Very difficult. And that tells you then, explains why you have our Chinese friends who say, you know, those parliamentary democracies are unable to deal with their problems because essentially they don't have the tools and the capacity to do. Well, we have to prove them wrong, but we haven't found out yet the way to do so.
Maybe as a footnote or a question, if you want to reply to that, wouldn't the EU be potentially one of the only integration communities that could be able to integrate futurity, so intergenerational equity, in its decision-making by different tools that are discussed, family votes, what have you, right? Wouldn't that be, if we're talking about we are at the dawn of a new era, something very credible from our own history, the evolution that we do see, and the way that European youth actually seems to be wanting to be integrated into politics? And if we do so, what does that do? No, that's another question that I want to put on after that. So aren't we in a way made for taking a next step in democracy by adding futurity and intergenerational equity concerns to decision making?
I think we are forced to think more and more out of the box to deal with a crisis that is real. I mean, there's a democracy crisis, and it's growing. And it has to do with inequalities, but it's not only inequalities. There's more to it than that. So we do have to think of new ways of strengthening and complementing our representative democracy. The kind of referendums we have had have certainly not been the answer. So we have to think of other ways. I mean, it's interesting, those assemblies, the consultative assemblies created for the conference on Europe, of the future of Europe, was an interesting experiment, but it has not delivered much. And the conference on the future of Europe has not delivered much. It's unlikely to deliver much. So we have to keep on trying. I'm not an expert on democracy issues. But what I do know for sure is that we need more different ways of tackling the problem, and not just by denouncing populism every time we have unpleasant people standing for election in our parliamentary elections.
Absolutely. So if you said that the change of representative democracy is important, I do think that at the level of institutionalizing these citizen assemblies, design thinking can help a lot. So you could institutionalize such small assemblies to parliamentary committees that are of high rank, constitutional rank, and make it, for example, obligatory to listen to them with far-reaching institutional reforms that we have in the future as a start into changing the way we think of representation.
Ireland had a very interesting experience with the abortion bill.
Same-sex marriage.
They set up a group of people who worked for months. They were chosen, if I remember well, by lottery.
Yeah, exactly.
They had the advice of experts. They worked for months, and their report influenced considerably the outcome of the referendum on abortion.
Exactly.
That may be an interesting model to work on in our other countries.
Yeah. It was transparent, it was broadcasted, people could tune in to see the discussion. So these are models that could indeed, as we need to discuss in view of enlargement, EU institutional reforms, be at least a bit of a breeding bed, a test laboratory for EU representation, representative democracy. Go ahead. If you don't mind, can we go back once again to green transition, innovation, what that can make to the economy we already discussed. What does that do with the EU's role in the world and with its geopolitical dimension and role? We are dependent on other countries for minerals and rare earths, right? We do have resources in Europe, Austria and Portugal, but the population is very hesitant to allow mining. We know that processing the minerals is quite dirty, so the question whether or not this would work with European environmental standards. Isn't the promise to ourselves to become a more high-tech, innovative economy also a promise to the world to establish more cooperation forums? Germany and Namibia do have a cooperation where they train young academics in green hydrogen, for example, to invest in upskilling in countries that were usually target for development policies. Is that something that Europe can capitalize on for the future, or would that be too costly if we see the need for internal reforms and investments?
No, I do think, Europe should have an alternative model to foreign policy and geopolitics. I don't think I'm entirely in cuckoo land, and I've never been in believing just Europe would be a civilian and soft power, that would be a solution to all our problems. But Europeans, because of experience, no longer take a Manichaean view of the world. We don't divide the world into goodies and baddies. And we are also no longer missionaries, because we've been missionaries in previous centuries at the expense of many of those people who received the missionaries. Okay, now one obvious area of priority for Europe, for obvious strategic and other reasons, is Africa. Europe needs to spend more time and think about how to establish closer ties of cooperation with Africa. Not only because of geographical proximity, not only because Africa is going to be the biggest source of immigration, or possibly also the biggest exporter of political instability, but also because Africa has many of the resources. And there could be a mutually beneficial interdependence. It is remarkable how little attention Europe has paid to Africa in recent decades, with very few exceptions. And I think it's about time we change that.
You said something else about interdependence, but before we move into that, I'm asking if there's a microphone in the room, because Elena Lazarou wants to come in. And Stella, I've seen you. Is there a microphone in the room, or, yeah?
Thank you. Well, I'm Elena Lazaru. I head the External Policies Unit at EPRS. Very nice to see you here and to listen to the presentation. Welcome. I mean, I'm going to rewind us a bit to the moment where you were talking about potential accession of Ukraine, because that's what my question was on. And I have to confess, I'm just asking you, I'm picking your brain on things we're thinking a lot about at EPRS, and others are here. I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit on how you would see institutional reforms in the EU needing to be if the Ukrainian accession were to happen. So, of course, you've mentioned a lot of the reasons why that would be difficult, the challenges, but if we were to think about a forward-looking paper, what would need to be happen on decision-making, on agricultural policy, on the budget? So that's something I'd really like to hear ideas on. And then perhaps, as you've just mentioned Africa now, just to add on that, you mentioned a while ago about the different theaters in which the EU operates and how we're looking at our neighborhood, but when something happens farther away, sometimes we're not there. Does Ukraine change this a bit? And I say this because suddenly, now that military support has been given to Ukraine in some form or other, the EU is getting a lot more requests from countries, particularly in Africa, to increase its financial support for the militaries. So, and if you look at the rate at which we're deploying now CSDP operations, it's actually, compared to before, much faster. So do you see Ukraine as a turning point also in this dimension of the EU expanding a bit more in terms of what it's doing in those theaters? Thank you.
You want to go one-on-one? Yeah. No?
Yeah, I think better, because otherwise I forget, and it comes with age.
I hear you.
Now, Ukraine is a turning point, but it is not also, but at the same, it's a turning point at the same time, it is at the tail end of a series of changes, which accentuate, accelerate the trend, but do not radically reverse it. That's the way I look at the world. Internal reforms. If we seriously mean business about enlarging, we have to address, first of all, the unanimity question. In foreign policy, in defense, and in taxation. All three. It makes no sense whatsoever to pretend that the European Union can be any kind of geopolitical actor when decisions on foreign policy have to be taken at unanimity, on a unanimity basis for 27 and tomorrow 35 countries. No way, Mackay. All right? So are we ready to face this or not? And if there is a constraint of a veto, let's do differentiation. Those willing and able should move ahead. I'm very pleased to read, not to know, that in the German coalition government document, this is one of the elements in the document that says that we should do away with unanimity in foreign policy issues, we should move to qualified majority. Macron has more or less said the same. Most issues and most important initiatives in the last 30 years have started with Franco-German initiatives and later developed into broader coalitions. Well, let France and Germany take the initiative on this as well. And those who are willing to go along, and others stay out. Okay? I don't see any other way, because if you talk to any European leader about the possibility of a treaty reform with the prospect of the unanimity principle and 20 out of 27 referendums, they go bananas, and rightly so, because the experience is not encouraging. All right? So we have a system in which, in order to change those things, we need unanimity. And at the same time, many countries have now adopted the habit of having referendums. Now, given the fact that in most of our countries, trust for political elites has come down significantly, Even if you have a referendum today and ask people, is it day or night, you will not get a 27 country unanimous agreement that it is day, okay? Because people will answer not whether it is day or night, but whether they like the government that asks the question. And if they hate it, they say it's midnight. Right? So given those constraints, I believe, and as long as we cannot do a treaty reform, the only option available is differentiation, I believe. Now, differentiation can work for foreign policy and defense. It cannot work for taxation, unfortunately. Because with taxation, you leave the free riders out. So the free riders will be delighted to stay out. So there you have to find another way of handling it. Agricultural policy. Again, you have to rethink agricultural policy. I mean, agricultural policy, as you know better than I do, still represents a very large chunk of the budget. Look at the reaction. Poland has been supporting Ukraine for everything, but when Ukrainian grain came to Poland, Polish farmers thought differently, and the government had to think differently. All right? So we have to look again at our common agricultural policy. Are we ready? Are we able to reform? Remains to be seen. So these are a few examples. But the other thing with Ukraine is, as it should also happen with Western Balkans, give you again one example. We shouldn't wait for the end of the accession process, which may last for long, before Serbia, for example, becomes a full member of Erasmus and Horizon, or even participates in the councils for Horizon and Erasmus, or anything similar. That then makes the waiting room totally different, okay? Because it also comes with money. But that brings me to the other very difficult issue, which we do not say. Most of our political leaders to be re-elected promise that they will not raise taxes. This is rubbish. It won't work. Given the need for public goods, especially given the need for security and climate policy, we need more tax revenues to fund our ambitions. Okay? So is the European Union ready to discuss its budget? Is it ready to discuss the possibility of one EU taxes, especially related to climate, which makes sense economically? If we are not, then we don't really mean business about the Green Deal, because we won't have the money to fund it. We will express polite ambitions, but we will not be able to deliver. So these are some of my answers to your question.
Great, thanks a lot. I do have 3 people on the list, potentially 4 people on the list, 5. So if you can be very crisp with your question, we have some 20-ish, 15-ish, 20-ish minutes to go. That would be very great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will be, my questions are very short normally. So my name is Stella Veliki. I have studied physics and informatics, and I am a member of the European Physical Society. I want only to say something. I don't agree with you, don't speak with China about the human rights, respect of human rights. We did the same things with Putin's Russia, and we have now a war in Ukraine. We don't do with China, we have a war in Taiwan. So it's not the right method. My question in this direction is, I see more the role of EU institution on international political place. What do you think about it of EU institution in Security Council of UN? UN is an institution now that is no more capable to do something, it must be reformed. And when it's being made, it was no EU. So what do you think about it? And the other question, the short one is, I agree with you when you say the EU must have a most important technical, economical, and scientific role on the international place, but I don't see from EU institution initiative in this sense. You have a lot of new technology now. They are very, very important. Artificial intelligence, all the things. I don't see, how do you think that the EU must change to become a very important, to have a very important place in this domain? So.
Okay, very briefly, I'm all in favor of the protection of human rights, but I honestly don't believe, based on experience, we can impose this on the world. Second, I don't believe that it is only autocracies that wage wars. Democracies wage wars as well, I'm sorry to say. Third, Europe is lagging behind in technology. That's a serious issue. Remember that if you take the biggest 10 or 15 companies in high tech worldwide, there's not a single European one. Interestingly enough, the comparative advantage of Europe in international trade has now become luxury goods as opposed to high tech. This is our comparative advantage. This is what we are selling before to Russian oligarchs and now to increasingly prosperous Chinese. Okay. If Europe's lagging in high technology continues, then the idea of being the regulator at the world level will simply not continue, because you cannot be a regulator if you're not a player. It's like in football, referees don't win games. It's players who win games, not the referees. So that would be my short answer, because Gaby tells me that I should be brief.
Thanks a lot for the discipline. I do have next on the list, Madame Spiraki. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Maria Spiraki, Member of the Parliament. My question, Professor, and thank you very much for being here with us, and your very interesting presentation is focusing on the implementation of Green Deal. According to my opinion, maybe we have to evaluate the outcomes of the Green Deal before we say that it will be a failure. And I would like to kindly ask you your opinion on the issue of the further engagement of the private sector, because I don't think that we can have the implementation of the Green Deal only with public money. And this is the first question. The second one is concerning the comparison between the steps forward coming from the EU and the IRA when it comes to the US and our competitiveness within the Western part. And the third one is concerning the incentives maybe we can give in order to further engage all players. Because I think that it's not only the tax raising the way that we can follow, maybe by reducing taxes and giving incentives, by having a very clear and concrete and consistent in a way legal framework, we can achieve a lot. Thank you very much for being here again.
Okay. I certainly do believe that the Green Deal or any green transition has to be based on a new kind of partnership between the public and the private sector. I take it for granted. The only thing I'm saying is that 20 years ago, when we still lived in the era of neoliberalism, people believed that the market will deliver the goods. The market on its own does not deliver the goods. Climate change is perhaps the best example of market failure. And we also discovered through the financial crisis that the financial system is neither rational nor stable either. So the only thing I'm saying is that we need to find in this world, especially of the green transition, a new kind of mode of partnership between private and public. I mean, I'm not suggesting, when I'm saying the return of the state, I'm not having the nightmare of a Soviet model of running the economy. That's obvious, but let me repeat it to avoid misunderstandings. Okay, now second, how do you do it? Through tax incentives or through subsidies? Good question. I think tax incentives may be a way. I mean, the American government is doing both. But the American government is also spending a hell of a lot of money on subsidization, okay? And I am not a believer in general that a reduction of taxation is the way to bring about growth on its own, and growth, the benefits of which trickle down to everybody. Because this is proved to be a fallacy on the basis of the experience of the last 30 years. We were told, low taxation, low state, leave the markets do their job, and the markets did not only deliver climate, financial, and all the rest, but they have also delivered an extremely unequal distribution of gains and losses, which is now undermining the very basis of our democracy, because our societies are more unequal, less so in Europe than in the United States. In fact, it is not surprising that the worst excesses of populism and demagoguery have happened in the two English-speaking countries, which are characterized by much higher inequality of income than in Europe, namely the UK and the United States. All right? So, okay, I mean, I understand that tax incentives may be one way, but this is not going to be enough. I still believe that we have to raise more money for taxation. And I know this is not popular. I mean, nobody is going to be elected on a ticket of higher taxation. Higher and more just taxation and better distributed, you can just about make it. In my country, in my own country, even that does not work today. Okay? So, yes, you have a point, but up to a point, I believe.
Hi, I'm Stratos Efthymiou from the Permanent Mission of Greece to the EU. The European Parliament rapporteur, Nacho Moore, just released his report on Turkey, coming to the conclusion that the EU accession process doesn't lead anywhere and that we need to reflect on alternative frameworks for the EU-Turkey relations. The issue is very, it's very big, but what is your opinion on that? I think that Greece is still one of the last of the Mohicans who, that still, we still believe that we shouldn't cut or break this relationship and wait and see. But I understand that we begin a reflection period on that.
Well, I mean, Turkey will continue to be one of the most important and difficult countries in the immediate neighborhood of the European Union. It is important for obvious reasons: size, location, and size, okay? At the same time, it's extremely difficult because you have a country that has veered away more and more from what we understand to be liberal democracy. It's an increasingly authoritarian state of a more Eurasian kind rather than the liberal democracy of the European kind that we have experienced inside the European Union. Still, we cannot ignore Turkey because Turkey has a big market. It is strategically important. It is a major passage for immigrants. So you have to try a combination of containment or carrot and stick. If Turkey were to become again a democratic country, a proper democratic country, we might again, but let me put it very honestly to you. When the prospect of Turkey as an EU member came up back in 1999, as a Greek, I was in favor. As a European, I had my serious doubts. Okay, because as a Greek, I need a neighbor who is stable, democratic, and Western. It's better than the alternative. As a European, the idea of trying to integrate a country that is so big, so different, at that time also much poorer, made me have a few nightmares. Right? Now, Mr. Erdogan has steered another course, so we know that many Europeans never believed in the European perspective of Turkey, if we want to be honest about it. This is no longer on, okay? But we still need to engage with Turkey. The last thing that Europe wants and Greece wants is Turkey moving off on a different anti-Western and anti-European course. This is the worst thing that can happen. But how do you do it? It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. Because among other things, Mr. Erdogan thinks of Turkey as not only an international player, but also has turned non-predictability into a virtue. And one of the things that he does is being non-predictable. So how do you deal with a guy who is non-predictable and in a country where power concentrates around just one person? It's like Putin, or perhaps even worse. Okay, so that doesn't make relations easy. But life is not easy.
So I'm the last, I think, to intervene. So I would like to thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I bought the book. I will read with a great interest. As a lawyer, as human rights lawyer, I'm working in the European Commission in human rights. And also as an activist for federalism, I would like to come back to the revision of the treaties and to give you a very, very concrete question, probably ask you, issues related with human rights. How you can imagine, without revision of the treaties, improve the rule of law, having in mind the limitation of Article 7. And then you know that the Commission will issue in July the new rule of law reports. So it's clearly that there are limitations in order to improve our democracy, the functioning, the basic of our democracy. How is possible to imagine improvement without treaty changes? And how it's possible also to continue to respond to the citizens' request to be more active in the area of health policy without treaty reform. What we have done the last 2 years, and as a member of the task force COVID, I can say, confirm, we make a kind of pirouette, legally speaking, to find solutions and to deliver results. Shall we continue like this in the future? And last point, how is possible also to improve the functioning of our democracy? We will have next year election in the European Parliament. Do you think that it's time now to promote some new ideas in order to improve democracy, having more truly European parties, have a kind of transnational list as we propose and to promote the last year? Many thanks.
Okay, I would agree with you if you could convince me about ways of changing the treaty. I agree in principle. The trouble is, how the hell do we do it? The only radical way of doing it, but it's too radical, I don't think we are ready for it, is for some countries to move ahead and sign another treaty. But the idea of reforming the treaties with 27 seems a pretty infeasible proposition today. I mean, I don't like it, but I probably have to live with that fact of life. I don't see any other possibility. I fully understand all your frustrations, objections. I agree with them. How do we deal with it? I just don't know. And there is a possibility, a radical one, of 10, 15 countries moving ahead and saying we sign another treaty. Okay? But the moment you start thinking of what this means, you lose your sleep and you probably stop thinking about it. All right, so that's the one. And then European Parliament elections. I hope, but I'm not optimistic, that we could have one transnational list alongside national lists at the European Parliament elections next year. but my wish may not be the same as reality. I'm told that this is not a likely development either. So we probably have to do with what we have. I do hope that we will increase participation rates. Some of the opinion polls, Eurobarometer, suggest that this may actually be the case, but it remains to be seen. And again, we will have huge variations in terms of abstention rates. As you know very well, there are countries inside the EU 27 where participation rates in European Parliament elections are shockingly low, which makes a mockery of representative democracy. When if you have participation rate of 20% and 25%, what does it really mean as an election? And I very much hope that the trust, I mean, it's interesting also, Eurobarometer tells us now that the majority of Europeans trust European institutions more than they trust their own national institutions. If I were too cynical, I might say because they know them less. But you don't want me to be cynical, so I wouldn't say that. I'm a fervent European, but at least I don't take my wishes always for reality. So that's my motto. But let's hope it works, because we need the European Union.
Great. So given that we started a bit late, I know that Sylvia is super crisp on the point always and very sharp. We have one last question from Sylvia from EPRS over here in the second row before we come to a conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Silvia Cotanidis from the EPRS. In view of the next elections that are coming, and in view of the fact that we have to stick together, is your message as Europeans, how do you see the trajectory of Eurosceptics in the next medium, long term? And one last observation, differentiated integration, I fully agree with you. It might not work with the sanctions, which is one of the most powerful tools that we have in this moment.
True, true. Euroscepticism is part of life. I mean, and it's like populism. I don't like to denounce anybody who has different views from me as being either undemocratic or somehow diverging from normality. If there are people who have different views about Europe, fair enough. I mean, in fact, there was a lot of talk, remember, before the last European election about the rise of Euroscepticism and so on. They registered about 25% of the vote, which is sort of nationalist Eurosceptic parties. Normal. Nothing wrong with it. I mean, 25% of the population who vote for people who are very critical or even opposed to further European integration, that's okay. I mean, we live in a democracy. 25% is not a bad number as far as I'm concerned. All right, so I don't, you see, the old idea that European integration was based on broad consensus, on unanimity. I mean, this can only be in the early stages of a political project. Once a political project takes substance, it starts affecting the everyday life of citizens, there has to be a reaction, and there will be winners and losers. I think one of the things that, at least looking back, that I've said and written in the past, I think I was one of the first ones to say that, was that European integration would be very much affected because with the expansion of the European project, there will be more winners and losers. I wrote that in the 1990s. And winners and losers is going to be one of the major issues of European integration. It has become so, and it will continue being so. And one of the things we have to do is deal with is think of the losers if we want to incorporate them in the process. So my answer is, okay, there is Euroscepticism. try to convince people, try to take, it's not only an illusion, try sometimes to change policies. Macron and Gilets jaunes. Okay, green transition is fine, but green transition cannot happen at the expense of the poorest sections of the population. You have to do something about the distributional effects of the green transition. The Just Transition Fund is a good idea, but we will need more money. And that's where we are stuck. Most of our ambitions, I come back to this, I've been saying, they require funding. And the political atmosphere is not conducive to higher taxation. You can deal with tax evasion. You can deal with the problem of multinational tax revenues. But still, this may not be enough. And our political leaders, understandably, cannot go to the public and say, we will need to raise money. But then that society that does not want to raise money expects the political system to deliver public goods. Now, public goods are not funded through an act of God. They cost. So you need to socialize people, make people understand what it means. If you want a livable environment, green transition is going to be very costly, at least in the transitional phase. If you want more security, security costs money. If you want to have a different relationship with Africa, it costs money. Okay? If you want to match Chinese expansion in Africa, you need to spend more money in Africa, as the Chinese have been doing for years. Now, try to explain this. Responsible politicians need to do that. But the trouble is, as my former, not mentor, but I used to be a member of the advisory board of Juncker, used to say, we know what needs to be done, we simply don't know how to be re-elected once we've done it. And he had a point. Juncker is a wise man. Okay, last words of Juncker.
Very well received in this city, I assume. Before I hand over to Etienne for his last word on the book talk, first of all, Loukas, thank you very much for coming to talk to us in person and to show us again the power of science policy interaction in such a very intimate dimension. Actually, it's just a fireplace and a nice cup of tea was missing. To nurture our ideas and the mental space we have to reflect on them for the future of Europe. This is the one huge thank you to you. And the second one is I place a request for commissioned research, 2017, in defense of Europe, 23, the coming of age. The Tsoukalimpics continue with 29, and the next book you will present on the next 6 years. So we extend the period of the Olympics to 6 years and would be very happy to see you again in 29. And in the meantime, we stay in contact via your work and your output that is very well received on the reflections on the future of Europe. Thank you very much, Loukas. And with that, over to Etienne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gaby, and thank you, Professor, for the very interesting discussion we had today. I mean, we could say a lot to conclude. I'd just like to pick three elements: own resources, foresight, and elections. And let me just explain a little bit. Own resources, as you know, the clock is ticking because we borrowed quite a lot of money for the RRF. And we don't know how to reimburse it. And we need to make a breakthrough on our own resources, and we don't know exactly how it's going to happen. But I think the discussion today has shown how important it is, and everything you have said about taxation is extremely relevant. Second, foresight. I think you explained very well how much we need to make democracy match with foresight, despite the short cycles of democratic life. And we need to have this anticipatory governance and have the tools to prepare the future. And that's something that is very central to the work of the EPRS. And just like to make a little advertising for some work on risks and capabilities that we are doing, because we have seen that we have been in the 2 last decades confronted with an acceleration of crisis, but we didn't have always the responses, and we need to work structurally on that. And the last point is elections. A lot can be said on the elections, and prognostic can be made, but what is very interesting in your book is, I think, and that's a message for the citizens, is that Europe is also able to deliver. And you gave very good examples where below a treaty change, and I think we still have a big potential below a change of the treaty, we can address crises and we can find responses with imagination. And you mentioned the vaccines, you mentioned the peace facility, and so on and so forth. And I think this should be also projected in these discussions we are going to have in the 10 months now, from now until the elections. So it's my turn to thank the members of parliament that came, the public online. It has been a great event. Thanks to you, Gaby, also coming from Florence. Thanks to you, Professor, for coming also and discussing your book. The book is available in the library, but of course you can also purchase it, and I'm sure it's a good summer reading. So thanks a lot. Have a great day. Next book talk will be in September. Bye-bye.